Welcome all to our next What ESG Investors Want webinar. And the topic for today's session is new sustainable debt structures, which I think is incredibly topical given the proliferation of new standards, new labels, new structures that we've seen in the market. And we certainly have come a long way from the quite one-dimensional nature of the green bond market some 7 or 8 years ago. The three labels that we'll be focusing on in the session today are social debt, sustainable KPI-linked debt, and transition debt. All labels and structures where we're seeing an increased uptick amongst the NatWest corporate client base. I'm very pleased to be joined by a panel of leading ESG investor experts from both sides of the Atlantic. We have Annika Lombardi, who works at Lord Abbett. We have Scott McLellan from BlackRock. And finally, we have Simon Bond from Columbia Threadneedle. So let's kick off with social debt, which is meant to be use of proceeds financing that is targeted at projects that support vulnerable or otherwise disadvantaged groups in society. And let me kick it off with you, Simon. I'm very mindful at Columbia Threadneedle. You've been running social debt impact funds since 2014. What is your approach to assessing social impact or the social alpha for your funds?
Yes, that's a term we coined ourselves, actually, social alpha. That's outperforming through the social characteristics of the fund. What we're looking to do is effectively, we're looking for evidence. We have an evidence-based analytical approach. And effectively, when you move from environmental to social, that measurement becomes quite difficult conceptually. We would take any measure from wherever we can find it, including engagement with issuing companies, and we will use that measurement as evidence in our evidence-based analytical approach. And what we do is we target specific areas that benefit society, and we follow the money through to the use of proceeds and to the good that money does being spent in society for communities, for economies. And basically that's the premise of the Social Bond Fund.
Excellent. And Scott, at BlackRock, I'm mindful, just like you have a scoring approach for green bonds, you also apply a scoring approach. I believe you call it a shades of gold approach to social debt. How do you differentiate within that scoring approach?
Social impact is for us, it's probably a relatively new parameter that we are assessing from a measurement standpoint within our portfolios. It's a bit of a normative construct, obviously, and we've tended to rely on companies to sort of help guide us, so to speak, in terms of what their priorities are. And we've looked very favorably upon sustainability plans in terms of outlining what a company's long-term goals are. And also, obviously, within the construct of social bonds and the types of causes that they are engaging in. We look at social impact actually through in both a social bond, but also in a KPI link structure, which I know we're going to talk to later in the call. But with regards to social bonds, and given the explosion in social bond growth, we saw this actually as a great opportunity for all of our ESG platform in terms of diversifying not only some of the issuers we engage with, but also in terms of diversifying some of the causes that we're engaging with. We do believe that this universe is going to grow. And so that led to this creation of what we have as a rating framework for social bonds, which, as you pointed out, has three ranking categories: light gold, medium gold, and dark gold. And we try and premise it upon the ICMA social bond principles and the ICMA harmonized framework for social bond impact reporting, which was released earlier this year. And basically, the gradation goes on the lower end of the spectrum from issuers that have laudable aspirations but are weak in terms of the details, such as the definition of their target populations and how they contextualize the problems, so to speak, as well as issues like transparency, for example, and the quality of their data. And then a dark gold issuer, it would be one that has a very well-defined target population, very transparent reporting program, very easily available data. There's a bit of a qualitative element to it. But we have analysts who are looking at it and now trying to grade that. And we provide that transparency to our investors so they can see how we're grading their portfolio. And we're happy to engage in conversations with issuers as well in terms of how their bonds would rank.
Thank you, Scott. And Annika, clearly, as a fund manager, an incredibly important input for you is the kind of questions and challenges that you're getting from your end clients, the asset owners, and what kind of questions are you getting in when it pertains to social policies and investment criteria?
Yeah, so we've definitely seen an increase in social related questions from our end clients, whether that's direct inquiries or through the RFP process. Our clients and potential clients want to know how we are addressing diversity and inclusion at Lord Abbett. What are our workplace policies like? How do we rank on different industry scoring metrics for best places to work for employees in general, or how do we treat working mothers in terms of our workplace policies? So that's really something we've seen increase recently. And I think as a result, it's also feeding down further through our own investment process. You know, if we as Lord Abbett believe that having better workplace policies, more diversity is good for business, then by definition, we should be requiring that of the companies we invest in as well. So it's very much a circular dynamic. Perfect.
And so, Simon, turning back to you, the social debt market has been evolving, right? It began in the development bank space and is now slowly moving into more the corporate sector. How do you see a for-profit company as effectively structuring a social debt instrument without being accused of social washing?
Yeah, social washing, SDG washing, rainbow washing, as it's sometimes called. These are all things that clients are asking us. How do we prove that actually what we're investing in is going to be good for society? And so we pass that question on every time we get a new issue, and we say, how can you prove that what you're doing, the use of proceeds, the proceeds that we're giving you, is going to do good for society? So even if it's a general corporate purposes type issue, when there is no specific use of proceeds like a social bond, we're still looking for where is the money going? How is that going to benefit society?
And are there any obvious sectors, Simon, where you would like to see more social debt additions from within the corporate space?
There's basically, we are calling for a widening of the types of issuers, and that's both down into corporates, banks, etc., but also governments. We saw yesterday Luxembourg issued a sustainability bond, which is projects that are both social and green. We see no reason why the current prevalence for green bond issuance in the sovereign space shouldn't then be extended through to sustainability bonds and ultimately to social bonds. Also local authorities, local regional governments, etc. And of course, corporates themselves. The first corporate to issue after the social bond principles were published was Danone. The first after the social bond principles was in fact an agency, BNG. But we would also like to see banks, as RBS have done, issue social bonds as well, because that's important to us, whereby somebody that borrows big and lends small, you can follow that kind of on lending through to the types of entities that aren't particularly big enough to issue a social bond in their own right. So people that come to me and say, could I issue a social bond, and are too small to borrow in the markets, I will say, well, go and talk to your commercial bank and encourage them to use that lending as part of their social bond issuance. Very important aggregator model.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you indeed for highlighting the RBS inaugural social bond, which I think was a transformational transaction for our own capital structure and sustainability strategy. Opening it up both to Scott and Annika, are there any other things you'd like to highlight in terms of how you'd like the social debt market to evolve?
I think it provides a lot of opportunity, quite frankly. I think we as I mentioned earlier, one thing we've really looked at is how can we inject more diversity into the ESG investing space. And I do think that social bonds offer the potential to offer diversity two ways. One, in terms of the diversification of issuers and sort of financial risk diversification. So that's something we've looked at. How can we step beyond some of the traditional green bond issuer sectors, such as REITs, banks, utilities, what have you, into other sectors. And I think social bonds could potentially, depending upon the cause, open up the door to, say, medical technology, pharmaceutical type names. It depends upon the issue, obviously. So I think that's definitely an area of focus. And I think diversification of issue as well is something that we've been looking at, and trying to increase the range of causes that our ESG funds are involved in and the good they're doing, so to speak. I think they offer potential there. And I think combined with the development of the market in social bonds, we're trying to push forward with greater accountability and impact. And we're trying to ensure that the impact, there's impact at the issuer level and how the issuer reports that impact, but also in our own funds. How do we disclose at a fund level the impact of the bonds that we own on society and the good they're doing for our investors? So those are two things that are also aligned, I think, with the whole social bond initiative.
Yeah, I think from our perspective at Lord Abbett, we view social bonds, or we analyze social bonds the same way we do KPI linked green bonds, et cetera. So for us, the most important things are having a clearly defined use of proceeds, clearly defined target projects or populations, and then ongoing reporting as to the impact of those use of proceeds.
Perfect. And I think that's quite a nice bridge into the next asset class that we'll be discussing, which is sustainability KPI linked, which are debt instruments where typically the pricing is linked to the issuer meeting or not meeting a sustainability target. And often a key part of the structuring there is developing a credible metric and credible target as it pertains to the issuer. And Annika, from a Lord Abbett perspective, how would you go about benchmarking and assessing a new sustainable KPI-linked investment opportunity?
Yeah, so we would do it from a couple different perspectives. I should mention that I'm the portfolio manager of our climate-focused bond fund, which invests in issuers that are having a positive impact on the environment. So how my fund assesses the KPI-linked bonds may differ slightly from how our non-SRI portfolios would assess those bonds. From the perspective of the climate fund, I am really looking for KPI-linked bonds where the KPIs are both meaningful to that company's operations, and also that the magnitude of the change in the KPIs is enough to make a difference. So I think we discussed this on an earlier call, Arthur, but for a company in, say, the fossil fuel sector, I'm not as concerned, or I'm not as interested in a bond that's linked to a KPI outside of, say, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It needs to be something that it needs to be quite difficult, actually, for the company to hit those KPIs, whereas some of our other less SRI-focused funds may have lower thresholds for the magnitude of the KPI change.
You've touched there on the fossil fuel industry, which has been one of the sectors, and as well as other harder to abate sectors that have been suggested could be fantastic candidates for this type of instrument. And Scott, how would you? What kind of issues would you like to see embrace the sustainable KPI-linked structure?
So I think we actually have looked positively on this, and I will say that every dealer we talk to, quite frankly, and many issuers are actively looking at this space and trying to use this as a tool for innovation, and we think it's quite positive. And not to sound like a broken record, one reason why we like it a lot is because it steps beyond the need for CapEx as a driving force in terms of issuing ESG-linked bonds. So you can basically apply the KPI-linked structure to almost any industry, which begins to really broaden the conversation, which we think is interesting. We are big believers in the ICMA framework, and so we would tend to look at the sustainability-linked bond principles as being a guiding characteristic or guiding framework, so to speak. And once again, when we think about a KPI structure, what we ideally like to see is that the company has a long-term sustainability program that can be linked to KPIs. If not a program, at least they have aspirations that are long-term and they have a vision, so to speak, as to where they want to take the company that can be linked directly to the long-term structure of their business and the future they see for their company. The KPIs have to have a high benchmark in terms of the level that is being set. That benchmark can be set based upon science-based factors, for example, and broader, big picture needs of society, such as the Paris Accord, what have you, but can also be set with regards to how are their peers doing and how they benchmark themselves relative to those peers. The data has to be transparent. They have to have a regular frequency of reporting, usually at least annual, for example. There has to be a historical track record of data. ICMA calls for around 3 years. And we have to think through, for example, what if the KPI stops being produced, or, what are the alternative sources of data, things like that we have to look through as well. So there's a number of criteria that we have, but we are very optimistic on the space and think that it could be a source of growth.
Great. And turning to you, Simon, it's fair to say when about a year ago, Enel issued one of the first sustainable KPI-linked debt instruments, that there wasn't a uniformly warm reception, and there were some investors quite concerned with the concept. And I'm mindful for you, and you've said this earlier, the use of proceeds and the ability to follow the money is very important from your perspective. In what cases would you be comfortable looking at a sustainability KPI-linked instrument?
I think there are several aspects of this, but the first relevant thing for Enel, of course, is that they did have green bond issuance. So they have actually done both. And we do look to follow the money through to the use of proceeds. But the key thing for us is evidence. The key thing for us is measurements, being able to determine whether the effect of the company on society is improved, etc. So we do recognise transition is absolutely essential. Transforming a company from perhaps fossil fuel based through to something more sustainable is absolutely what we want to encourage. Our preference in the case of Enel would have been for the more traditional use of proceeds. However, where that's not possible, we recognise, and we're going to get on to transition bonds themselves, but we see this as part of that transition. And absolutely, we need to transition. We will not get everything done. We will not hit net zero by 2050 or whatever the national target is unless we get transforming companies. And so it's a necessary thing. And again, we very much favour ICMA. I sat on the Social Bond Principles Working Party for, in fact, I continue to, I was going to say many years, but since they were published, was part of that. So we very much back up the formalisation of this through the ICMA principles generally. But what we're looking for is evidence of the good that particular company is doing on the wider society, wider economies, etc. So it's clearly on the evidence, and everything we look at really is based on evidence. Show me how this is going to make a difference. And if those kind of KPIs are prevalent, and those kind of KPIs being appropriate, and it's not possible to do a specific use of proceeds bond, then absolutely we would encompass those. And indeed, that kind of information, even in a general corporate purposes bond, is very relevant for what we're trying to do.
And the other, of course, important element when structuring these instruments beyond the KPI is the impact on bond characteristics. And we've seen now a few examples where there's a coupon step up, 25 basis points. How do you go about assessing whether that's the right delta, whether that's the right pricing impact for the instrument? How do you determine that?
That's
Yes.
me. Who's
And that's for Annika. Apologies.
sorry? Didn't.
Yeah, I think for me, the increase or in the coupon step needs to be significant enough that the issuer is incentivized to actually hit their KPIs. And I understand that, if this is their first KPI linked bond, perhaps a coupon increase, if they don't hit their KPIs, may not affect their overall cost of capital too significantly, but I would like to see an onerous enough coupon step that it gives me confidence that they will do everything in their power to meet those KPI targets.
That makes sense. And perhaps Scott, Simon, are there other points you'd like to raise in terms of the development of the KPI linked asset class? Something we haven't yet covered.
I think there's an interesting, once again, it comes, we're trying to develop a structure along the lines of how we perceive our overall philosophy with regards to ESG. And we think it should be linked to a company's longer term direction. And in that light, I would say we also look favorably upon the concept of multiple KPIs and multiple goals. And I would say one key driving factor for us is how do we link governance into a KPI structure? It's core to the financial success of a company, but it also has very strong relevance to an ESG context, and also in terms of the ability and willingness of a company to achieve an ESG outcome. So we look very seriously upon multiple KPIs and also the concept of governance, making sure that it's incorporated into a structure.
And Arthur, just from me, the concern that I have is based on the premise that we have that you can do good through your portfolios without sacrificing financial return. And so the return to our investors needs to be preserved. We think actually you can have your cake and eat it. I spent the last 6.5 years proving that you can have your cake and eat it. So no sacrifice of financial returns. What concerns me about linking to the coupon, and particularly actually when you start to have a drop down in coupon for achieving goals rather than a step up on missing the goals that you're looking for, is that link between the financial return and doing good, which necessarily implies that there is an offset, there is a sacrifice here. So that's our concern, and we've seen it in the loan market. We don't really want to see it seeping through into the bond market. Fine, having a punitive step up, which enhances the return, but actually that link between the financial return and the social outcome, the social impact, we think you should be able to do both at the same time.
Great, thank you very much. And that takes us to the third growing asset class. And I should say thank you already to the questions coming in after we've covered this topic. We'll get to the live Q&A. But the third topic is transition finance. And that's often understood as being funding for projects that are supportive for a company or a sector's decarbonization agenda, without necessarily being quite carbon neutral or fully Paris Agreement aligned yet. So examples could be more energy efficient ships or planes, or diesel to gas transition projects. Scott, I know in the past colleagues of yours at BlackRock have called for more quote unquote brown issuers to issue green bonds. I guess that sounds like potentially quite a good space for transition finance. How would you consider this label?
Yeah, I think BlackRock is a microcosm of the broader universe in a sense. I think there are some who fall on the more positive outlook for transition finance, and many who fall on and others, I should say, who fall on the less positive outlook. I think one of the issues with transition finance is that in many respects, it remains a relatively weakly defined sector of ESG. However, I would say overall, if you look across our our portfolios, there is flexibility to engage in transition finance conversations. And I think that's reflected in the way we have a rating spectrum for social bonds and green bonds, for example. The idea is to be transparent and also disclose sort of where issuers fall within that spectrum. I think there's a belief that in order to really move the ball down the field, so to speak, we need to start stepping beyond just the pure top tier issuers in the ESG space and begin to engage with the some of the light brownish companies and help them to do good. So there is a willingness to overall to engage with these issuers and to try and find ways to assist them in an ESG format.
And Annika, I know that for your climate fund, you've said in the past that there's I think quite a lot of instances where a green bond doesn't meet your criteria, doesn't stand up to that test. How would you assess, in comparison to transition investment, to make sure it's credible, whether for the climate fund or for any other portfolio for that matter?
Sure. So unfortunately, I think most transition financing would not be eligible for our climate fund. Just by definition, as their business models transition, they're probably not yet to the point where they're actually having a positive impact on the environment. So that fund does tend to stick more towards traditional green bonds, but we do have a wide range of portfolios that can and will invest in transition finance. And I think something Scott mentioned earlier is key. We would look at it in the context of the issuer's longer term sustainability plans. So obviously, if the issuer does not have an entity-wide long-term sustainability plan, then perhaps the transition finance may be deemed as more opportunistic, and we would wonder how it fits into their longer-term plans. We definitely want to see not just one bond issuance, but a wide array of activities that company is taking, that issuer is taking to transition to a more sustainable business model.
Great. Simon, it's very often we talk about ESG or green and social as if they're quite different concepts, sort of separate universes. How do you feel about that? How do you see the linkages between these areas?
It's quite a common thing, isn't it? I mean, I actually talked myself about the measurement side when you move from E to S. Actually, I don't think you do move from E to S. I think in terms of if we want to get to net zero by 2050 or whatever the target is, we need to spend quite a lot of money, and we need to make sure that the cost of getting to net zero by 2050 isn't borne by those in society least able to afford it. So there has to be a social element in the context of environmental. And indeed, on the social side, I run social bond funds. You might say, well, I don't care about the environment. Let me tell you, if we get the environment wrong, I can see some of the biggest social consequences as a result of that. And so you can't separate those two entirely. You have to look at making all of it better. That said, I will go further in terms of the social side, perhaps into areas where the environmental side is more questionable. You mentioned some of those transport infrastructure facilities, etc. So we will look at airports in terms of their employment capabilities, in terms of the way they act as catalysts for local economies, etc., etc. Where maybe an environmental person would just look at the nasty aviation fuel, etc. But we are looking into the transition of that kind of facility. And actually, when you think about what the bond market is good at doing, the bond market is good at funding infrastructure, physical things. Think back to the railway bonds of the Victorian era. Think of how transformatory that particular investment became for societies, the Industrial Revolution. We need to employ those kinds of capital spending policies towards transforming ourselves to a much greener economy going forward. And so we very much advocate using any kind of bond, but particularly bonds that are going to transform, that are going to transition our economy. So setting the agenda and facilitating those changes that we need. So retrofitting of gas pipelines so they can take hydrogen and methane, absolutely essential to be able to facilitate moving to a greener economy going forward. So separating the E and the S, very difficult. Don't think you should do it. I think you ought to actually, even in an environmental fund, consider social consequences, and certainly in a social fund, we clearly consider the environmental consequences.
And Scott, Annika, any additional thoughts you had about this emerging label of transition and how and where it should apply?
Yeah, I think, it comes down to, in big picture terms, sort of transition to what? What's your goal? And then, as Annika pointed out as well, I think there has to be a vision. Are you going for net zero by a particular time point, or is there another marker along the way? And then trying to assess how realistic is it, that plan might be, and how high the bar is. Those are the conversations that we have with regards to the credibility of a transition program. But I think, to echo the points that have been made, I think that it's important. I think if you look at the Bank of England, I think came out with studies that showed that somewhere around 70% of bank capital currently is engaged in the fossil fuel or transition-related assets. So the problem is big. It's meaningful, and if we are going to actually make progress towards Paris, what have you, we need to address it, and we need to be engaging and thinking, putting our heads together. And most of the ESG actively managed funds at BlackRock are able to sort of engage in these kind of discussions, and I think it's a conversation we're going to see more of going forward.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I do think transition finance, whether it's in labeled transition bonds or KPI linked bonds, is absolutely necessary. We won't hit our environmental or other social and governance targets without additional capital. And I do think these are going to be very important instruments to get us there.